afternoon, everyone. We're now going to start our the second parallel session. So we have three presenters today, Dr. Imran, Rasul, Dr. Kashif, Malik, and myself. We are going to be presenting our recent work and, well, in some cases, not so recent work. And then that will be followed by some comments by Dr. Naved Hamid, who's a session discussant, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. So without further ado, Dr. Imran, if you would like to start.
Okay, thanks, Farah, and thanks for the organizers for inviting me to come and present at the conference. I'm delighted to be part of this and very much looking forward to the entire program. The work I'm going to present today is joined with Adnan Khan and Anam Shoaib, who is formerly based at SERP. And it's trying to understand sort of a key question that many policymakers around the developing world are trying to engage with, which is to try to understand how should we optimally design social protection programs for the very poorest. So we're at a stage in the economics literature where we have a growing evidence base to suggest that there's very high returns from in-kind asset transfers towards the poor. My own work and work of others over the last few years have shown that those types of interventions tend to be very effective, cost-effective in terms of having internal rates of return between 14% and 20%, irrespective of where they're actually implemented. Most of those asset transfer programs take the form of providing the very poorest in rural economies with some form of livestock assets, and recipient households using those to generate earnings. That's very similar to other kinds of large-scale in-kind public works programs that we're very familiar with, such as NREGA in India. But at the same time, we have this parallel strand of literature that increasingly shows the efficacy of the provision of cash transfers. And Chris Blackman and others have been very influential and very instrumental in building up a body of evidence to suggest there may be similarly high rates of return to just giving the poor cash and allowing them to spend it as they see fit. And so this choice between in-kind versus cash is a very sort of long-standing policy debate in most countries, but it's very much at the forefront of the policy agenda for many developing countries. So what we're going to do in this study is to provide direct evidence on the comparison between these two forms of social protection program in the very same context of households in rural Pakistan. And so we're going to compare how households respond in terms of some key economic outcomes to the provision of in-kind asset transfers versus unconditional cash transfers. And we know that under a standard model where we have perfect markets and households have very standard decision-making processes, then it's always possible to perfectly replicate any outcomes from in-kind transfers just by giving unconditional cash transfers. That standard theory would suggest you can never do worse by giving unconditional cash transfers because the poor can always replicate what they would have done with an in-kind transfer. And so understanding whether that statement actually turns out to be empirically true in this particular context is going to be informative of two classes of explanation of why there might be a wedge between the returns to in-kind versus cash transfers. The first class relates to market imperfections that the poor might face, and the second class, driving a wedge between the returns of these two forms of social protection, is that the nature of household decision-making may be influenced by the metric in which transfers are made. So let me flesh that out a little bit more. There can be a whole variety of market imperfections that we might think prevent unconditional cash transfers and in-kind transfers having exactly the same returns. So there may be transactions costs that the poor face in being able to access markets, and so there's some leakage in being given a certain set of resources and the types of assets you can convert those resources into. There may also be missing markets or imperfect markets, such as the markets for skills, potentially the market for information, that mean that people can't just buy in the marketplace what we might be able to provide them in an in-kind transfer. And there may also be informal taxation by kin. There's lots of evidence from around the world, including South Asia, that there are informal tax systems where households that receive additional resources may be taxed by others around them. Those taxes may be more effective to apply when households receive cash rather than in-kind, indivisible assets, for example. And in terms of the second class of explanation for why there's a wedge, but potentially a wedge between these two types of transfer, it all relates to decision-making processes of the poor and how they may move away depending on the form in which the transfer is provided. And so there may be labeling or mental accounting effects. There may be a notion of commitment and self-control that's easier to resolve by giving asset transfers rather than cash transfers. And there may simply be a demand for agency or control that households themselves display. So even though they would exactly replicate the in-kind transfer with the cash transfer, households may get some utility from having those decision-making rights and being the ones who actually get to implement those choices. At the same time, it's well recognized that in-kind transfers may be more costly to implement than unconditional cash transfers. And an important element of the policy debate is that political support amongst non-beneficiaries might hinge on transfers to the poor being provided in kind rather than in cash. We're often very concerned that the median voter doesn't want transfers to be provided in cash because the poor may spend those transfers on things that the non-beneficiaries wouldn't approve of. And in addition, there can be other mechanisms such as endorsement effects and sort of labeling cash transfers. So that's just to say there's a large class of explanation of why the returns to cash and in-kind transfers may differ. We're now going to try to study that question in this particular context to understand whether and why those divergences occur. And so this is going to be a direct comparison between these two main forms of social protection program. And ultimately, we want to answer which one is more cost-effective. So we're going to do that in the context of rural Pakistan, around some areas that I'll show you on a map in a second, throughout 4 districts in Punjab. So this was a randomized control trial, which is large-scale and long-term. It's large-scale because we're going to cover over 10,000 households. It's closer to 15,000 households that we've been tracking over the course of 7 years. In fact, the latest data that we have is post-pandemic. I'm not going to show you any results post-pandemic. This is all in the 4 years prior to the pandemic. The evaluation takes place in over 100 villages throughout 4 districts of southern Punjab. And this is stratified random sampling, where we're going to stratify the villages based on geography and their village size. In both treatment and control villages, we'll have a complete roster, complete census of households that we conduct. And that's going to allow us to build a continuous poverty score for households both in treatment and control. You'll be eligible for the transfers or for the cash in treated villages if you have a poverty score below 18. And that's going to correspond to about a quarter of all households in these villages will be potentially eligible for these interventions. Just to give you an indication of the context and the setting, this is just a map that shows you the villages in which the study takes place, spread out over Punjab. And so the interventions are trying to replicate what many governments are trying to grapple with. So the first treatment is going to be an in-kind asset transfer provided to households. And so when we first go to households in these villages, in these T1 villages, we essentially give them a menu of assets. And it's literally like a menu as you'd find in a restaurant. And I'll give you an indication of what one of these typical menus looks like, which has various assets on it and an associated price of those assets. Okay, and what households can do is to choose any combination of assets from this asset menu up to the value of 62,000 rupees. If they decide to spend more than that, they have to top up the difference themselves. And if they decide to spend less than that, then the money doesn't go to them. It's just kept by us as the experimenters. Okay, so I'll show you what one of these village asset lists looks like on this slide here. So there's various types of asset that are provided, both in the form of livestock, potentially setting up in small businesses, even some assets that we were willing to provide in terms of farm production and so on and so forth. The choice of these assets was based on sort of a market study of what was economically viable in these villages pre-intervention. And so these assets differ slightly across different villages depending on the nature in their marketplace. But the vast majority of households choose some combination of livestock when presented with this village asset list. And that's what happens in the first group of villages, in the T1 villages, where we're providing these transfers in kind. Each of these, the prices that are shown here are indicative. There's a little bit of variation across villages in the prices, depending on the quality of livestock and the breed of livestock that we're able to get access to. And for each form of asset combination that's provided, there's an additional piece of training that's also provided to households. And the combination of the value of the assets plus the training is what comes to 62,000 in total. Okay, so households may not be used to working with these types of assets, so they need some kind of human capital improvement as well as this physical capital injection. So it's that combination of those two forms of capital that we're providing from this asset menu in the first treatment arm. In the second treatment arm, the asset menu looks identical, except the final line says, or you can take 62,000 rupees as an unconditional cash transfer. Okay, so it's exactly the same asset menu choice, but with one addition, which is that you can choose to take it as an unconditional cash transfer. Okay? And so the value of these two interventions, from our point of view, from the social planner's point of view, is identical. Per beneficiary, the cost is exactly the same. It's 62,000. There's some slight differences in the cost of implementing them. It's slightly more costly to implement the asset transfers because we need to spend time going with the beneficiaries to a local market to purchase that. But on the grand scale of things, you can think of these two programs as essentially being equated in terms of their costs. Now what we want to understand is, are the benefits actually the same or not? Okay, so that's the setup of the intervention. And so I'll show you what households actually do in the next couple of slides. So just to set up how we set up the evaluation, this is a randomized control trial. So we have treated villages and control villages. 100 villages in total, roughly split between a third are assigned to controls, a third are assigned to the in-kind asset transfer, and a third are assigned to the in-kind asset transfer with the additional option of the unconditional cash transfer. This is going to be a partial population experiment. So in both treated and control villages, we'll observe eligible households as well as non-eligible households. And a large part of the study is to understand the full distributional impacts of these types of resource injection into villages. I'm not going to talk too much about the non-ultra poor households, the households who are never eligible for the program, but they are there part of the study. The other wrinkle is that in treated villages, a quarter of households are eligible by being below the poverty score of 18 to receive these transfers. We didn't have the resources to provide a quarter of them this type of cash or asset transfer. So within treated villages, we randomly assign amongst the eligibles which eligibles actually are offered the intervention. So within a treated village, amongst those who are eligible, we have a second stage of randomization. So I'm going to be comparing the treated ultra poor versus the not treated ultra poor, and they're going to exist in treated villages. So that's going to allow us a comparison within a village between households who are both ultra poor, but one just happened to be treated, the other one not, to really narrow in on differences that the program's causing within the same village. We can obviously look between treatment and control villages as well for some other comparisons as well. Okay. And as I mentioned, as it's a partial population experiment, in both treated and control villages, we also observe the non-ultra poor, the households who were never eligible for the program, and we choose a random sample of households from across the wealth distribution to understand how does the intervention not just impact the poor, but how does it impact the non-poor who may be engaged in economic activities with the poor pre-intervention. How do those relationships change? And that allows us to understand what happens to village level inequality, not just to the average levels of outcomes for the poor. That's useful for some of our other work. So to give you a sense of what these villages and households look like, this is just some summary statistics on villages in our sample. So the key thing I just want to highlight here is that, as I mentioned, about a quarter of households in treated locations, we were able to treat roughly about 45% of all households who were eligible, and that gives us a split between the treated ultra-poor and the not treated ultra-poor. In terms of household characteristics, if we just compare characteristics of the treated ultra-poor households in T1 and T2, I don't think this is, T1 and T2, and relative to the controls, we have fairly large samples here. The average poverty score of households is the same across we have very good balance here. They're well below 18. Households are fairly large, and you can see some of their other characteristics here as well. These households, many of them reside in extreme poverty. About a third of them reside below the global extreme poverty line, and their total expenditures on food are close to sort of 3/4, which is another indicator of their extreme economic vulnerability at baseline. So now you're all wondering, what did they actually choose, and what did they do? So in our first group of villages under treatment 1 that were only offered the list of assets, you can see that, you know, more than 75% of households choose some combination of livestock. Okay, that's mainly what they do. We evaluated all of these to be potentially profitable in these village economies, but we don't see an even split of households. Most households, when given this choice of assets that they themselves are not paying for, prefer to engage in livestock activity. So that tells us something about what they believe are the relative returns to some of these asset transfers. In villages in which we provided the same list of assets, but in addition offered cash, around about 96% of households chose cash over the assets. We believe in hot and cold decision making, so we thought that, you know, once households have told us they prefer cash, we wouldn't implement that immediately. We would let them decide amongst themselves and come back 2 weeks later to see whether they changed their mind once they talk to their spouse, when they talk to other members of their family in the village. Nobody changes their mind. Okay, everybody chooses the cash over the assets, which again is revealing that they think they can generate higher rates of return from being allowed to spend the money as they would like to, rather than being told which assets they should pick and choose from. And what's interesting is that the right-hand side pie chart just shows you when we provided them the cash, we asked them, what do you plan to do with this cash? And so most of them say this big blue region here is that they're planning to purchase livestock with this cash. In fact, to a large extent, what they're planning to do is just replicate what we offered them in the asset choice, but there is a demand for agency amongst the poor. They would like to be able to spend the cash to buy the assets themselves rather than being given the assets by a third party. What's also important is that they didn't list many explanations of what they wanted to spend the cash on for items that weren't listed on our asset menu. So for example, very few households said they were going to use the cash to migrate. Very few households said they would use the cash to invest in education. That would have been a bit of a complication for us, because then the cash and the assets wouldn't have really been used for the same purposes. That isn't the case. Most of what households plan to do is to use the cash to invest in exactly the types of productive assets that were offered to them, but they prefer to make that choice themselves rather than be guided into it. Okay, so let me conclude by showing you what happened. So we've been tracking these households at very high frequency, so I'll show you impacts of what happened 4 months after the intervention, that assets or cash were transferred, 8 months after, and 1 year after. I'm going to show you those high frequency amounts because when you're providing households cash, in order to track what happens to that cash, you need to survey them quite frequently. And I'll show you what are the impacts on consumption and assets by comparing the treated ultra-poor to ultra-poor households in control villages. We'll do an across-village comparison there, between-village comparison. And then for the long-run impacts, which are 2 years after the intervention and 4 years after the intervention, I'll show you impacts on consumption and assets. And there, in these longer surveys, we also surveyed the not treated ultra-poor households in treated villages. So there I'll show you a more precise within-village comparison. Okay, so let's run through those short-run impacts and then the long-run impacts. And I'll show you the same margins in the short run and the long run. It will be consumption and the accumulation of productive assets. So the tables all look very similar. So let me just run through this step by step. So these are the 4-month impacts 8-month impacts and 1-year impacts for households who were offered the asset transfer. And these are the corresponding impacts for households who were offered assets plus one additional line item, which was the cash. And so I sometimes refer to treatment 2 as where households have revealed preferred that they would rather take the unconditional cash transfer because they had the choice of getting the assets, but they preferred that they would rather have the unconditional cash transfer. So what happens is that in the short run, for those first 12 months, in terms of consuming their own produced milk, that's less likely to occur for those households with an asset transfer. For those households that receive an unconditional cash transfer, they're more likely to purchase livestock and start producing milk from it almost directly. And so you do see big impacts over that first year on them. We don't see dramatically different improvements in nutrition overall. And for both asset transfers and unconditional cash transfers, we do see responses in expenditures, but in the very short term. In the longer term, we don't see much change in consumption or non-food expenditure or food expenditures for either forms of transfer. Okay. Households respond in the very short term by consuming some of this, but that's not sustained. They're using it for other types of activity. When we look in the short run in terms of asset accumulation, we again see some slight differences between the two forms of transfer. In particular, when we look at investments into home improvements, they're more likely to occur a year later for those households who had cash rather than assets. In addition, in terms of ownership of livestock, that's greater for households who were given essentially livestock in the form of an asset transfer rather than households who received cash. The magnitude of the effect is about half in terms of ownership of any livestock. And the reason for that is what I alluded to before, that when households are offered the cash, many of them, but not all of them, decide to invest in livestock. So there's a little bit of leakage. Where does that money go? It goes into home improvements rather than into productive assets. And so there's a greater impact on these various types of productive assets for those households who were given asset transfers rather than cash transfers. In the longer term, those differences tend to narrow quite a bit. So in the longer term, when we look 2 years after the intervention takes place, or 4 years after, there are very similar patterns in terms of whether households are consuming their own milk. Potentially there's slightly better improvements in diet for households who were given assets 4 years before, but the long-run impacts on food expenditures are quite similar. Food expenditures rise by about 4%, irrespective of the form in which the transfer is given. Non-food expenditures don't rise even 4 years after the intervention. And in terms of long-run impacts on assets, if we just focus in on the 4-year impacts, any short-run differences just tend to wash out. And so in the long run, we find that both households are about 16 to 17% more likely to own any livestock, with these patterns of impacts across different types of livestock, with the value of livestock also rising 4 years later. So when households are provided cash rather than the assets directly, they do end up purchasing similar amounts of livestock to households who were provided assets directly. And overall, the value of their livestock, if anything, is slightly higher than households who were provided the assets directly. So just to conclude, the long-run differences, depending on which form of social protection we offer, tend to be quite small and quite subtle. You can find some outcomes on which they're quite different and other outcomes on which they're not. But the majority of outcomes and the magnitudes of the impacts on both consumption and productive assets suggest that the form of asset transfer or form of transfer that we make to the poor doesn't really make such a big difference. We spend a lot of time debating should it be in-kind asset transfers or unconditional cash transfers. Our results suggest that in the short run there might be some differences, but 2 years later, 4 years later, the impacts on consumption and assets of these households is approximately the same. It doesn't make a difference which form of transfer we provide. It might do if you're concerned about one particular outcome, but on the whole, we don't find stark differences that returns to one type of transfer are higher than for another. Both have comparable impacts on consumption and asset accumulation. There's many other outcomes that we could also try to look at that I simply haven't had time to document that there may be slightly larger differences on. And so, these returns to these asset transfers don't differ, and that suggests that markets here are operating relatively effectively. There aren't large market imperfections that the poor face, contrary to what I suggested at the start of the presentation. And decision-making of the poor isn't biased. It isn't fundamentally different if it's cash or assets. They may be slightly more likely to use cash for home investments rather than productive investments. But overall, the results seem to suggest the form of asset transfers, the form of transfers we make have very, very similar rates of return, irrespective of the metric in which we make them. Okay, I'm going to stop there and...
Thank you very much for inviting me. First, it's a pleasure to share panel with Dr. Imran, and I must admit that I learned a lot from this. Actually, we as a group learned a lot from his research. So this is joint work with Faisal Bari from LAMS, Makki, and Simon from Oxford. And so access to finance is often listed as one of the most important constraints to small and micro firms in developing countries. And there was a lot of initial excitement about microfinance being the game changer in terms of improving business outcomes and household welfare. But a number of recent studies have shown relatively low impact on business outcomes and household welfare. So what we proposed is that access to finance is important for micro businesses, since commercial banks are not going to lend money to micro borrowers. So we have to come up with such products which are sort of show some flexibility in terms of payment repayments or payment structures. And we also advised or proposed that the microfinance institution and the borrowers, they share the risk and reward in a product. Okay, so as we know that asset-based financing is one of the most important capital investment in the world. However, when we see in most of the low-income countries, smaller firms only have access to debt, and that is with a rigid repayment structure. And some of the reasons are client selection, monitoring costs, and misalignment in loan officers' incentives. So in this project, we conducted a field experiment in which we offer large amount, 4 times the upper limit of the loan size to the graduated borrowers, and we offered it as an asset-based shared ownership contract. So we worked with one of the largest microfinance institutions in Pakistan, that is Lahore, and we offered them an asset which is worth up to 200,000. And we offer 2 types of contracts. One is fixed repayment, and other is flexible repayment contract. And some of the broad research questions we were looking for are micro enterprises interested in asset-based shared ownership contracts? What is the impact of such businesses or such contracts on businesses and household welfare? Can larger financial products generate sustained improvements in micro enterprise growth and performance? And how important is repayment flexibility in such contracts? So just to share a summary of our results, we find high take-up rates up to 57%, and our treatment significantly see a probability of increased probability of running a business by up to 9%. Business assets for treatment went up by 40%. Profits went up by 11%. And this leads to greater household income and a positive impact on consumption expenditure, and which is persistent over time. The interesting result which we found when we disaggregated consumption, that is a greater spending on school, food as well, but it was a small number. And the best part on the part of microfinance institution is that they got their money back. Okay, so just to touch upon some of the literature, some of the initial evidence shown in the studies that microcredit does not have on average transformational effects. We see that there was a relatively low take-up, some unprofitable investment, and there's no substantial increase in income or other key outcomes. And if you look at the previous work that has provided poor individuals in low-income countries with large capital injections has found substantial persistent increase in business and household income. And studies investigating innovations in microcredit contract structure have found that grace periods can help increase business investments and profits. And we also refer Dr. Rasul's work here. Okay, so, but the most important part is the seminal work by Banerjee et al., in which they suggested that the future work should be towards contractual innovation and non-credit structures. And that is the gap which we filled in the literature, that we come up with an asset-based microfinance with asset transfer to the graduated borrowers. Okay, so we worked with Ahwad, one of the largest microfinance institutions in Pakistan. And the sample consists of urban and semi-urban micro entrepreneurs who have graduated with at least one cycle of loan, and they've attained the highest borrowing limit of 50,000 rupees. So these values are from 2017-18, so don't confuse them with that. So this is 50,000, and the other amount is almost 200,000. And those borrowers have shown interest in expanding their business by buying a fixed asset, so which is almost 4 times the borrowing limit. So it is a shared ownership declining balance contract. In Islamic terminology, it is diminishing musharaka, where the microfinance institution and client share the principal amount initially. And then there's ijara, which is sort of a rental contract. I mean, in Anglo-American law, it's more like a hire purchase contract with rent-to-own payment structure. So we offer 2 types of contracts. One is the fixed repayment contract, and other is a flexible repayment contract. So in fixed repayment contract, they have to pay 5% of the principal amount every month. And then there's a 1% charge on the internet, which decreases over time as the principal share of the client increases in the ownership. For the flexible contract, it is almost half the percentage of the fixed contract. Reason being that we wanted to involve the skin of the borrower somehow so that he doesn't run away after the contract expires by just returning the asset. For the default procedure, we really wanted microfinance institution to share the downside of the product. So the default procedure is such that if the borrower misses one payment, then 1 month grace period is given to them. And after that, if they don't pay, the microfinance institution will go and repossess the asset, and then it is sold in the market, and the proceeds is disbursed according to the share of the microfinance institution and the borrower. So the microfinance institution truly shared the loss in its true sense. And control group is eligible for 50,000 rupees during the same time period of the contract, and it's at 0 interest loan. Okay, so here is a contract comparison between control, fixed, and flexible contracts. So the duration is 18 months for all. Control group gets 50,000, fixed and flexible. The two treatments will get up to 200,000 of asset financing. There's no guarantor. Individual liability is there. Asset is purchased with the help of microfinance institution, and asset is serving as a collateral as well. There's an intermediate rental payment for the asset use. So initially, both have to share, so 10% is paid by the client and 90% is paid by the microfinance institution. So if they miss payment, they will get a warning letter, and after the grace period expires, asset is repossessed, and then it is sold in the market. So the difference between fixed and flexible contract is that at the end of 18 months, for the flexible contract, the borrower owns almost half of the asset. So if he wants to buy the asset, then he has to pay the rest of the amount. Or if he gives back the asset, then it will be sold in the market, and the proceeds will be dispersed accordingly. Okay, so here's an example of a fixed repayment contract. We assume 100,000 rupees just to make it simple. So MFI's ownership is 90% because 10% is shared by the client. And then the client has to pay 5,000 every month, right, which is 5% almost. And that is the principal amount which he pays for 18 months. And 1% is the rental rate. So as the ownership increases, the rental amount decreases. Right? So at the end of the contract, the client pays 8,550 as a rent, plus the principal, and he owns the asset. Now, in flexible contract, I've shared two scenarios here. One is where client has to pay the minimum 2.5% or 2,500 every month. So at the end of the 18 month, if he doesn't pay all of the amount, then he either has to purchase the asset, or he has to, then the MFI will repossess the asset, they will sell the market, and then it is shared according to the ownership share. On the other hand, since this is a flexible contract, borrowers can pay off with their own ease. So for instance, here we made a 9-month contract. So in that case, he's paying much more than required, even higher than the fixed amount, and he pays off in the 9th month, and he owns the asset. And if you compare flexible contract with fixed contract, since this is diminishing at a decreasing rate, so in flexible contract, they end up paying more rental amount as compared to fixed contract. So how we implement this? So we identified through a sample interested borrowers. We invited them to a workshop, and then they completed a baseline survey and behavioral games. And then we offered them 3 types of contracts. So we actually randomized and stratified based on microenterprise type, performance, and gender. And then we offered, so the control group will get a loan of up to 50,000. Then T1 is the fixed repayment contract, and T2 is the flexible repayment contract. So initially we offered them fixed repayment contract, right? And then later we offered them flexible repayment contract. And those who are not interested or who denied the flexible repayment contract, they can get a fixed contract. There were about 7% borrowers who opted for the fixed contract by denying or rejecting the flexible contract. And all clients, including the control group, were visited in person to record their take-up decisions. Okay, so here is a balance test across our sample for control and treatment 1 and treatment 2. And we did not see any significant difference across age, business experience, business revenues, business profits, and other variables. And this is for wage income, household saving, house loans, management practices index, risk aversion index, etc. Okay, so the asset financed, majority were rickshaws, then we have sewing machines, manufacturing, welding machines, other transportation, cameras, food machines, computer, photocopier, printer. In some of the assets, we also offered bundles, but those bundles were not more than 3 since we wanted fixed assets. So even when we offered bundle, these are all complementary assets. Okay. Okay, so this graph, I mean, we see the repayments by both fixed and flexible contracts. So in panel A, if we see the blue line shares the actual the required payments, and this rectangular thing is showing the actual payments. So we see that most of the borrowers have actually paid in time. There were a couple of cases in the end where some flexibility were offered to few clients. If you look at the flexible repayment, so this green line shows the 2.5% which was required, and the blue line shows that if it's a fixed contract amount, and you see some of them paid the required amount, which is for the fixed repayment, fixed contract, but others accepted this flexibility. And similarly, I mean, in the right panel, we see that there are payments under flexible contracts, and in the end, the total payment was actually higher than the required amount because these were the borrowers who haven't paid according to the required amount of the flexible contract. And some of them really paid in the form of a fixed contract. Okay, so our model is simple. It's in COVA specification with strata dummies, pooling across treatments and clustering at the respondent level. So these are the business outcomes. So if you see that clearly our treatment is almost 8% higher than the control mean to run a business, and 0.10 for the number of businesses. And the important result is the assets, business assets, that the treatment is more likely to own business assets with almost 40% higher than the control mean. Business revenue is positive, but it is insignificant. Similarly, I mean, we see that the business profits are higher for the treatment compared to the control, and business employees, it's a small number, but it is insignificant. Now, when we disaggregate the capital assets, we see that most of the variation is defined by the fixed asset in this, and it is significant. The other current assets cash, it is not significant, though a small number. And looking at the inventory, the treatment has less likely to keep the inventory compared to the control mean, and similarly, accounts receivable. Now, this is the distribution function for the fixed asset, and we see that for the treatment, it is clearly it is a right shift in the distribution function compared to the control mean. Okay, so this is the treatment effect on household outcomes. We clearly see a significant increase in income, in household consumption expenditure. Household savings are positive, but it is not significant. Household assets is also positive, but it is not significant. So after seeing that there's an increase in consumption, we disaggregated the consumption to see where lies the bigger effect. This is the distribution function for consumption expenditure, which moves right to the control. So when we disaggregated household consumption, we see that there's increase in food, spending on food, clothing, bills. The interesting result is the significant increase, almost 26% compared to the control mean on schooling. On the other hand, if we look at health, special occasions, and household items, it is positive, but it is not significant. So when we saw this increase in spending in schooling, we went to the field and actually we asked specific questions about schooling for the 24th wave, and the results are here. So we see that there's a significant increase in expenditures on girls, on education expenditures, as well as boys. And in this case, expenditure on girls is higher than on the boys. And further, looking at the expenditures on schooling, on books, on transport, etc., we see increase in most of the variables, and books and materials, it is significant. It is significant for transport as well, and food expenditure as well. And this is the distribution function, clearly showing the distribution going to the right of the control. Okay, we also asked a number of questions and made an index on management practices. And we see that this performs well in terms of marketing, management overall, especially in terms of buying stock control. This result is significant, and this can be explained in terms of likelihood of negotiating with suppliers, likelihood of comparing prices for alternate suppliers, and likelihood of running out of inventories. So our results are robust. We winserize at 1%, 5%, and 10%, and we have a low attrition rate, which is 4.7%, with no correlation with the treatment, uncorrelated with treatment. And we also check the stability of our results for both treatments and the survey waves, and our results were robust for that. Robust and persistence. Okay, so quickly the conclusion, time is out of. So we offer large financing graduated micro-entrepreneurs using an asset-based share contract. We found high take-up rates, high repayment rates, and we found significant gains in micro-enterprise asset profits, and in turn, household income and consumption. And our results show that large asset-based microfinance contracts have the potential to stimulate micro-enterprise growth among graduated borrowers. Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone. So I'm going to shift gears. We've just looked at two presentations with very large products and assets. I'm going to be looking at a very small micro asset. The motivation for this study actually comes from the fact that we, not only in Pakistan, but in general in this area, the savings rate are very low. Savings rate, according to one estimate, have never increased beyond 20% in this area, and they've expected to have gone down dramatically over the last few years. And so there are obviously a host of different reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that maybe individuals in low income particularly have commitment issues. That's basically financial discipline, which either through interpersonal reasons or intrapersonal reasons. For instance, maybe women face a lot of pressure from others to share their resources. Maybe it's the fact that you forget sometimes to save. Maybe it's impatience. Maybe there's some kind of time inconsistency. For multiple reasons, people just don't save. Even if they want to, they're unable to save. Right? So there could be some barriers to saving, and there's definitely been some evidence from literature that shows that different commitment devices do work. There's a particular commitment device that's inherent in all microfinance products where they have this rigid structure. The idea is if people follow that structure, they get used to paying on time, and so there's some financial discipline that's imposed on people. And we also know about group lending. So the idea behind group lending is you have this peer pressure that forces people to kind of have some financial discipline. So there's evidence on commitment devices, but most of this evidence, in fact, if not all of this evidence, comes from a literature that considers savings and credit to be two different domains of decision making. And there's work, including our own previous work on which we based this study, which says that in conditions where people struggle to hold balances over time, and they also want to incur some lumpy expenditure, in those cases, you can consider credit and savings to be substitutes. They are essentially products that allow you to commit to a kind of a payment scheme in exchange for lump sum payout. Right? So that's the idea, and that's basically, it's not a new idea, but it hasn't been tested in the field. So what we do in the study is we jointly test the demand for a microcredit and a micro-saving commitment product. I'll explain what this product is, and it may be familiar to most, if not all of you. It's actually something that's very common across many different countries, but it's not been formalized. We also test the demand for additional commitment features, such as reminders, penalties for not making payments on time, and conversely, actually removing that penalty and having more flexibility in making payments in time. So as far as we know, this is the first experiment which tests how the demand for commitment can vary depending on whether it's embedded in a credit or a savings product. So what does this contract look like? This looks like a conventional ROSCA, or what we know in Pakistan as a committee product. Right? So we're all familiar with committees. What happens in a committee is that a group of people get together. They make a decision about making payments into a common pool at regular intervals of a fixed amount. Everyone does that, for a number of period of time, and they take turns in getting the contents of that common pool. Right? So it's very similar to what you would expect in a credit or a savings product as well, where you are making payments at a fixed schedule, and then at some point for credit it's upfront, and then for savings at the end of the contract, you do receive that lump sum also. Right? In our case, we kind of test out a ROSCA, but this is a weekly ROSCA, so you're making weekly payments into a pool. The way that this is slightly different from a committee, though, is that a group of people are not getting together. It's essentially an individual and a microfinance bank. So the counterparty in our case is a microfinance bank. Otherwise, it works exactly like a committee would. So it's an individual financial product offered by implementation partner, the National Rural Support Program in Pakistan. We offer this product to everyone thrice. The reason for this is we wanted to make sure that the same group of people get this committee product multiple times. So sometimes they'll receive a credit product, sometimes they'll receive a savings product, and we want to know if the same group of people who've taken up a credit product also end up taking up a savings product and vice versa. Over these 3 product cycles, we vary a number of things. So we vary whether or not you get payment right now, which is a credit product, or you get payment at the end of the contract, which is like a savings product. We also vary the return that you get from this. So this is another departure from a typical committee structure. In a typical committee structure, you don't get any return, right? So you get back what you've paid into the common pool. Your return is equal to 0. But we also test when you get a positive return or when you get a negative return. In other words, when do you get some kind of subsidy on a credit product, and when is it that you have to pay also to get some lump sum at the end or at the beginning. We also vary over 2 different experiments. We vary the number of weeks of this contract, so whether it's a 1.5 month or a 6-week contract, or if it's a 2-month contract, and we vary the installment size. So in one phase, we have an installment size of 1,000. In the other phase, we have an installment size which is smaller, of 500. Right? So all across, we are kind of randomizing and varying the amount that you get, when you get it, whether you get it with a positive rate of return or a negative rate of return. And as you can imagine, because there are so many different combinations, we end up doing this in 2 different experiments. I'm going to show you the results together, but these are 2 separate experiments. So let me give you an example of what a product would look like. Here's an example of a credit product. So every time that the loan officer goes to our clients, they would literally just take out chits from a bag, which would determine whether you get payment right now or at the end. So here's an example. If you get payment right now, you would get a lump sum in the first week, and for the rest of the 5 weeks, you pay 1,000 into the common pool, which is held by the MFI. If this is a 0 interest product, then you get 5,000, and in total, you end up paying back 5,000, right? This is phase 1. In phase 2, we have a slightly longer contract, so it's 8 weeks, but this installment size is small. So we're just trying to test if the duration and size of installment makes a difference, and I'll show you later that it essentially doesn't. So this is a credit product. This is a credit product with a negative return. So you can see here, you receive $3,200, but you end up paying back $3,500. This is a typical credit product. If you think about it, you get a lump sum, but you pay something back with interest, right? So this is the normal credit product that you see in the market. Then we have this one where the interest rate is 0. This is something that you don't see in the market. It's like an interest-free loan, but there are, typically in the market, there are other hidden costs. Here, there's nothing. And then we also have something where you get a positive return. So here you get $3,800, but you've paid back $3,500, right? So this is essentially arbitrage. You're getting money right now. You can technically keep that money with you for the next 7 weeks, and then you can use the lump sum to just pay back that money. You'll still end up with 300 rupees, right? So the reason why we're testing these different things is we're looking at, okay, so one of our products is a standard credit product. The other one is a product that we want to just test our theory against, and we want to say, if the traditional financial theory is correct, everyone should take up this product, because here there's no risk. You're getting money right now. It's arbitrage, right? This is what a savings product would look like. So the only difference is when you're getting the lump sum. So if you get the lump sum at the end, it's like a typical savings product. You have a commitment to pay into a common pool. That pool is yours. You'll get it at the end. You could get it at 0 interest. You could get it at positive interest. This is what a typical savings product is like. You earn an interest on your savings. But here you're actually paying to save, right? So here you have a cost of $300. You give $3,500 to the bank. They only return $3,200 2 months later. So if the traditional financial theory is correct, we should see 0 demand for this. Essentially, people can just keep money with themselves, and they'll end up with more money than the product that we're offering. So these 2 extremes are what we actually want to test the traditional theory predictions against as well. Then, as I said, we also test the demand for additional reminders and additional commitment features. This was done in only the second experiment, not the first one. So what we do in the second experiment is we said, okay, we can help remind you when a payment is due. There are 2 different kinds of reminders. You can get a reminder to yourself, or you can designate a family member, and we will call that family member up to remind you, right? So 2 different kinds of reminders, and then the 2 different kinds of flexibility. So here we have flexibility, which you can increase flexibility or reduce it. In the sunk product, we reduce the flexibility. We say if you miss a payment, not only you have to pay back what you owe us, but you have to give us 500 rupees extra, which is like an extra installment you're paying. Conversely, you can reduce the penalty. You can increase flexibility. Here we're saying, look, we understand sometimes some things come up. You can't pay back on time. We will give you 1 chance over the course of 8 weeks to delay a payment. You just have to inform us beforehand, even a day beforehand, and then without any additional interest, you can pay 2 installments together. Right? So there's an option to increase flexibility as well. So overall, it's a complicated structure. We randomize across different products. In the first phase, as I mentioned, we just have the basic committee product. So half of the sample gets that committee, half doesn't. In the second phase, we have all of these reminders, respondent reminders, peer reminders. You have the basic product, you have the sunk product, you have the flex product. So we have 9 different kinds of treatments that people have been randomized into. And then we have about a quarter of the sample that gets nothing, right? So this is done, people, for instance, if we say you have a sunk treatment with respondent reminders, if they say we don't want to be reminded, they are not offered this product. So that's a refusal of the product. You can't refuse a feature, you have to refuse the entire product. Okay. So we do this between 2014 and 2016. So as I said earlier, when we were starting this seminar, this is not some recent work, but this is still, it's work that's been done in 6 different districts, so we think there's a lot of general validity across Punjab at least. We have about 3,000 women only in the sample. So NRSP lends, at least on paper, only to women. So all of our clients are women with a median age of about 38, education of 4 years. Most of them are married with 3 kids. And the median monthly household consumption at that point, so this is in 2014 and 15, was about 17,000. So a typical microfinance sample. What is very interesting over here is that about 3/4 of our sample in both phases report that we find it very difficult to save on our own. Again, these are women, so they have a lot of pressure perhaps to share resources with other members of the family. So I'll show you just immediately what the take-up was like, what the demand was like. What I'm going to show you over here is what the overall demand was for different kinds of products. Right? So here I'm showing you all across. This is phase 1. I'll also show you phase 2. But what you can see over here is overall the demand for credit is higher than the demand for savings. Again, this was expected. This is what we see in the field in general. The demand for savings is not as high. And what is also reassuring is that the demand actually increases with the amount of money that you're getting back, right? So the cost is high, then you don't demand this product. When you're getting some money back, the demand is high. You see this in phase 1, where, as I mentioned, the installment was higher, but the duration was smaller. You also see this in phase 2. So there's no really difference between phase 1 and phase 2. So what I'll show you after this is essentially results from phase 2, where the sample is essentially larger. So, some predictions about the standard model come true. Credit is demanded more than savings because you're getting money up front. When you get more money, obviously you demand the product more, so that's all fine. But if you look at the 2 extremes, for instance, if you look at this product, this is a savings product where you're getting money after 2 months and you're also losing 300. So under the standard financial model, you should get 0 demand here. But the fact that there is a demand could imply to us, it implies basically that there's a pure demand for commitment, that we want something that commits our financial resources, we pay something according to a schedule, and then at the end we can get some access to a lump sum payment, which we can't save on our own. You'll also notice on this end over here, you have what we call the arbitrage or the subsidized credit product. Here the financial theory would tell us, the demand should be 100%, everyone should want this product because you're just essentially handing people 300 rupees for free. But we don't see that. So this would be the case if, for instance, people fear that if we get this money, we may not have the commitment or we may not have the discipline to actually pay back the installments on time, and then we'll have this microfinance organization that chases after us. So overall, this seems that there's the underlying demand for these microcredit products is a demand for commitment. Also notice the size of the products are such, so there's 5,000, 3,500. We're not saying these are productive investments. We're not saying they can be invested in enterprises or some kind of an asset that we just looked at in the first 2 presentations. These are essentially to manage liquidity, right? So how could we explain this? We think this is a situation where you can't save on your own, then this is a product that allows you to save up something and get money at the end. I can show you also that this is actually when we start to split up the sample according to who said that we find it hard to save. We do find that women who said we find it very hard to save, who have commitment issues, they are the ones who are driving this demand. So here I show you the demand from the 25% of our sample that said, look, we don't have any issues in saving, we're fine. And here is the demand for those who said we have problems in saving. So almost all of this demand seems to be driven by women who at least know that we have issues. We can't save as easily on our own, and so we'd like some assistance. So that's one thing. We think there's a demand for commitment. But the other thing is we said, well, what do they do this with this money? If it's a liquidity concern, we say they're going to be using it for managing liquidity. They're going to be buying lumpy goods with this. So we asked at Endline, what did you end up using this money for? The first 8, which are in blue, the first 8 bars are about 80% of the use. These are all, if you think about it, 7 of these are all on lumpy expenditure, right? So for appliances, for wedding celebrations, for medical expenses, food could be something which is not lumpy expenditure, but it's about 20% of the use. But here also we expect there's going to be some quantity discounts. So even here, you would expect that there's some demand for lumpy expenditure for food. Okay. So very quickly about reminders as well, because we're short on time, let me just show you what the results are. Here is the demand for the basic committee product. On their own, the flex, as well as the reminders, don't actually increase demand. So the demand for the flex and the sunk is smaller than the demand for the basic product. People don't seem to be demanding either the flexibility, they don't like the penalties, they don't like reminders either. We see some kind of indication that perhaps the flex with the self-reminder may have worked, but we don't see any significant impacts. We do see that for sure people really dislike the strict product where they're given a penalty and it's their family members who get a call and they have all this information about what money is due when. So we don't see any additional demand for additional commitment products. So there's an inherent commitment in the basic structure of a credit and a savings product seems to be sufficient to meet this commitment demand. Again, we can split this up by those who said that we can't save. Again, it seems to be driven mostly, as you can see over here, these are women who said we have difficulties holding cash. These are the women who actually like these strict products. So they like the sunk products where they will be penalized for not making payments on time, and they want reminders to either themselves and to their family members. So these additional features also, the demand seems to be driven by women who have discipline issues and commitment issues. Okay. Very quickly, because I think this is relevant for practical implications, the repayment delinquency default on the whole in the sample was low. It was about 12%, which is just basically saying that was an installment even delayed by a day. Overall, the microfinance institution recovered the lump sum amount and the owed amount completely, but this is just basically that they delay even by a day. It's as expected, it's more likely for savings product than credit products because in credit products, the microfinance really chases after you. It's also less likely with reminders and penalties. So on a practical note, with the sunk, actually the default rates were halved. They were around 5% to 6%. So they were actually very effective in reducing that default. We don't see any robust effects on the household assets, chances of running a business. So as Kashif was mentioning in his presentation, these are unproductive investments inherently. So we weren't expecting to see these impacts, and this is in line with some recent work also on microcredit and microsavings. So overall, we test the role of commitment in microfinance. We do this through a rotating structure of a ROSCA. We find that this product can be implemented formally in the field. It is practical for both the microfinance organization. They don't suffer from any high defaults. And there's also substantial demand for this. We don't see any additional demand for additional commitment features. So we don't see any demand for reminders or sunk, with the exception that there may be some women who have commitment problems, and particularly in the savings domain, they do appreciate being reminded or having some additional penalties on not making payments on time. We don't think that this is this means that there's no demand for commitment. We just think that this means that the demand for commitment is mostly satisfied by the existing structure of a conventional microfinance or a micro savings product. So I'll stop here.
My task is relatively easy because on the one hand, I'm very familiar with this work and I've been hearing this now for many years. I was telling Kashif that some version of it was presented at our ADE conference 2 years ago. He said, no, it was 4 years ago. So it's been that long. And of course, Imran presented it at the PAPF conference on development. So this is very familiar work to me. And these are three very innovative and interesting studies addressing different issues there. And I don't think, though in a normal conference people talk about the methodology and that technical aspects, but I don't think makes any sense for me to talk about it. Once I'm not competent to talk about that with the speakers that we have. And secondly, most of this work is very advanced. A lot of it has already been published. or is close to being published. So therefore, nothing will be gained by, as far as I can see, from focusing on that aspect. However, I would like to focus here on what are the policy implications of these studies, because the conference itself is Pathways to Development, and we've always thought of microfinance as a very, very important instrument for poverty alleviation and control. We also have thought of a lot of these studies, this Kashif mentioned, that it does not seem to make much difference in terms of income, in terms of business growth, in terms of all those variables, nice ones. And then they try to explain that, why it is, and females get this loan, or there's family labor being used, or whatever it is. But that evidence is very discouraging. And therefore, it is very important, because that really is a good instrument, to find some alternative paths of achieving that goal. And I think these three provide us with potential directions where these could go. So I think that there are a lot of policy implications, as well as implications for further extension of this work that has been presented. So first, I think I'd like to start with Imran's paper. And to me, it's a surprise, because I thought that really in the rural areas, markets don't work. We've heard about these commitment problems, and therefore, if you give them cash, they'd probably buy it. And also, initial results seem to indicate they spend it on durables, and etc. So that was what I was expecting. But in the long term, it seems it doesn't make any difference. And I don't know, maybe if Imran can talk a bit about that aspect, why it doesn't make any difference. Even technical help and assistance and training, that doesn't seem to make any difference. They all end up doing about equally well. Of course, the policy implication then is straightforward, that if it doesn't make any difference, then it's much more costly to do an in-kind as the transfer, and therefore just give cash. So I would be very interested in knowing from Imran that does he actually believe that, or was there something special happening in this particular case where we ended up with this situation? Because one possibility, of course, is since these were offered that in the same village, asset transfer, and there was some peer group pressure, there was some information happening, and therefore those worked. Or I don't know what was happening there, why this happened. But if this is true and these qualifications are limited, then I think that clearly unconditional transfer is the way to go. The second thing is that, as we see, microfinance doesn't seem to make much difference in terms of income and what you call outcomes, family outcomes, and other business outcomes. But clearly, a large transfer does seem to make a difference. And there the question really is that I've been associated with PPF, which Imran was working with. We've used billions of dollars to do this. And question is that really a waste? Should we be actually just looking at giving cash transfers? And obviously, there is a certain cost to the operations that we do with microfinance. I mean, it's subsidized, most of the work that we do. Of course, now there are private providers, and that's a whole different ball game, and one doesn't want to go into that. What are the implications of that? So that is a question which needs to be addressed, I think, that would be. And I always thought that these political projects or programs where they have a lump sum payment, they call them youth to the youth or to some other group or whatever. And I always thought this is a boondoggle. I mean, how is it possible that this is going to make an impact? But given what Imran has said, it might mean that it's not. And what we need to do is to ensure appropriate selection and implementation, and it may be much more effective than these monthly payments that we make. Because the objective, if the objective is to ultimately bring people out of poverty. So that's one of the criticisms that one makes of cash transfers, that they become permanently dependent. And so this seems to give them assets, it gives them higher income, etc., and therefore there's the potential to come out of poverty. So maybe that's my take on that. Huge policy implications, but I would be interested in maybe here or later finding out what's special here. Is there anything special, or would it work under normal circumstances? As far as Kashif is concerned, that is very, very interesting findings. And obviously, this is a bit of a special group, that these people have of course, have borrowed more than once, or at least once. They've reached the maximum limit. So this is not your ordinary microfinance. But for this particular group, I think that it's a huge implications. And of course, since we've had this microfinance running in Pakistan now for maybe at least, I remember, 90s, it started 90s, let's say 15, 20 years. So there must be a lot of people who meet the criteria of your group, those who have borrowed and paid back and are graduates and are at the maximum limit. So clearly, this is a way to go, and maybe there's a need to develop programs where you actually target those groups. Again, with the objective, if you want people to come out of poverty. Otherwise, with microfinance, it's, again, long-term dependence, and nothing else seems to be happening. So here, there are various other options that can be looked at, but was it much more costly to implement this equity thing? But there is always that issue that if you have equity, what you call type of product, do you get your money back, or will they run away? Your results seem to say that doesn't happen. So I think I'd be very interested in finding out, is this more generalizable, or is it more specific? In case of Farah, of course, again, I have been involved with that for so long, and my only complaint there is, I mean, it's amazing study, and it shows there's a huge demand for commitment and saving products. And unfortunately, we don't have any saving products in any significant amount for the poor. So I have been very keen on them to push this in this direction, that the NRSP Bank should now launch a saving product using this. And also this ROSCA kind of a picture that we present. Actually, it's maybe a conventional credit product or conventional saving product, but people find it easy to understand the mechanism. And I think that if you could do that, and also, obviously seems unfair, but the return doesn't seem to matter that much. If it doesn't matter, then this scheme could be almost self-financing, because if it is a pure saving product with no return, then that return part could be used as a servicing cost of running that operation. So I would be very interested in going further with this. Of course, there are some limitations. This product was for a very small time, 6 weeks or 8 weeks. but it does demonstrate the demand, and I would be very interested. And from the IGC side, we have been very keen to finance the policy aspect of this. So now, can we take it to the next level? And again, that's a huge problem because researchers have no incentive to invest time and resources in turning their research into policy products. And unfortunately, what we do find in our IGC work, that this microfinance work has no impact. I mean, since we are unable to show impact in the way which donors would like to see, the impact on policy, impact on something. So this is, I think, the direction we need to go with these products to actually have these being offered on scale and by number of institutions. So I'm going to stop here, and I'd like to, obviously, everybody get involved in this discussion, because this is the key, that what are the policy implications, and can we get this into policy? Otherwise, yes, we can publish, we get tenure, we go up, and have what we call ego rents or whatever there are. Everybody says, my God, what a researcher. But from the country point of view, and all of us are interested in development from that aspect, how do we take it to the next level to convert this into policy implications? Thank you very much.
Time for questions, if there are any.
I actually had a question. I know Imran, kind of walked over, and he had a very interesting, the treatment, the two treatment arms that you guys are working on with the, the asset transfer as well as the, the unconditional cash transfers. My question is that you mentioned somewhere about there's like a demand for agency among the poor, but you did not like sort of talk in detail about that. And I wanted to understand that, as well as, kind of coming back to what Anam, I believe, you were discussing that, how you basically talked about how the saving products were used for certain things. And then there was like a very similar mix, where either they used livestock in Imran's case, or in your case, it was mostly like weddings or other. But there was very little on business or other things. So I just want to understand from your perspective the agency part, and then overall if you guys can talk about how these choices are made. Yeah, thank you. Oh, my name is Sakiba, and I'm actually part of SERP. So
we can collect a round of questions and then we can answer. Yeah.
Actually, I have 2 or 3 questions. The first one is from Imran. It's about the types of assets. In the menu, there are some assets which require low skill, like grocery shop, while other assets like tailoring or bicycle shop, they require a relatively high skill. I was wondering that, did you compare the effect on assets and food items among these different assets, individuals? My second question is from Kashif Malik. You have considered graduated borrowers. I was wondering that, if a borrower is already graduated, it means he has some extra skills and experience or other discipline, which might have affected your treatment effects. I was wondering that why didn't you consider ungraduated borrowers as a treatment, and what would have the effect of the treatment on that case? And my last question is from Farah. I think in traditional community, there is always credit and saving, because one of the reasons that in traditional community, everybody knows each other, they trust each other, and due to which they are ready for both credit and saving. However, in your case, as you discussed, that macroeconomic theory also tells that nobody wants to have saving. They go for the credit. But it is the other way around in the traditional community. I was wondering that did you consider this trust situation in your case? Thank you.
One more question from this side, and then I'm afraid we'll have to stop from here. Please, thank you.
Okay, my question from Imran is that you don't find a significant difference in the acquisition of assets, whether they are in kind or whether a cash transfer is given. Is that because the recipients somehow do not have trust in the in-kind transfer, and they feel that they have superior knowledge of, for example, the livestock that they could acquire themselves? And also, was there like any kind of prompt given that if they do not spend this money on for the purpose that it is being given, there will be some kind of penalty, which really then moves them away from consumption, putting it into consumption? Second question is for Kashif. Now, since you find the human capital impacts on girls' education, did you compare that with, for example, programs of conditional cash transfers for education, like Wasila-e-Taaleem or the PEF? That is there a different impact? Thank you.
Let me just rush through a few initial thoughts. I mean, just those two questions are very similar, actually, in terms of the demand for agency. There's many studies shown in lab experiments. People are willing to pay to make decisions, even if they're not the most informed person about those decisions. And that's what we really find here. So when households purchase livestock with the cash, we find they actually pay higher prices for the same quality livestock, and they actually tend to purchase worse quality livestock. But that is what they're willing to give up in order to make the decision themselves. And then that feeds through into slightly lower rates of return to livestock after 4 years. So there is that demand for agency that they would like, and that's not a bad thing in any way. And Naved, to your point, it was surprising to us as well that the return, there is not strong evidence of market imperfections here. Why did it work so effectively? I think a couple of reasons. Partly it's because it wasn't just an unconditional cash transfer. It's revealed preferred because you're given this choice of assets at the same time. So naturally, the way that the intervention's being framed is in the context of productive investments. There's no penalties for households if they don't spend it that way, but you're already putting into people's minds this idea that use the cash for something that's productive. It makes a big difference exactly how you frame it. The fact that we didn't say whatever you decide on this day is what we'll implement. We'll come back in 2 weeks' time. Think about it. Draw up a plan, an investment plan. But it shows that the money isn't just used for consumption. It is actually used for really productive purposes. What I don't know today is whether there's a difference in response to the pandemic. So there we see what happens when you have an aggregate shock, and perhaps these small differences that we observe year by year actually have a big impact when you're hit by a big shock. But invite me back next year and I'll give the answer.
Okay, so your question about graduated borrowers. So in this particular study, we actually targeted those borrowers who've already graduated. So the whole purpose is that we were targeting a bundle that a person is already doing a business and now he wants to expand his business by buying a fixed asset, right? So practically we haven't thought about this. In the long term, of course, we wanted to check this risk-sharing products and number of other products, even in like a working capital thing. But in this particular study, the whole objective is different. That's why. Okay, Malia, Assalamu alaikum. You're a student from Qaeda Azam's University back in 2000. You don't recognize me, I do. Yes. Thanks for the compliment. Okay, so this result actually caught us by surprise. So in our 18th month follow-up survey, we see this increase in the spending on education. And then in our last wave, we actually asked particular questions to see where these funds are being spent. So honestly, we haven't compared this with any other study for now.
It's a good result.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so in our 24th month wave, we particularly asked few questions, and if you've seen the results for the education, it was only for the last wave, not for the all 5 follow-up surveys. So it's a good suggestion. We'll definitely compare these results with the unconditional transfers.
It also relates to the perception about gender norms, and you don't see that being validated.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's counterintuitive.
Yeah. Thanks for the suggestion.
No,
2000.
So I won't keep people long. I know everyone's waiting for tea. But so quick answers on the enterprise and businesses. We did have women who had at least said at baseline we have a business. They don't end up using this money for that business. We think because the amount is too small. But there's other evidence also from Pakistan, from work we've done and others have done, which shows that even the standard loan is not being invested in business. It's perhaps something in the structure, or perhaps, as Dr. Alia was saying, they're gender norms. On the trust, so 2 qualifiers. One, they know NRSP, so there's some level of trust as well there. We don't see any heterogeneity by how long they've known NRSP, but having said that, that's also correlated with other things like income and all of that. But the other thing is we deliberately chose a microfinance sample also because we thought this is where the demand is going to come from. If people don't want a micro loan or a micro savings product in the first place, and they're not going to be interested in some variation of it. But I take your point that it's to be tested whether or not in a general public, how well would this do. My own feeling is trust is not an issue with an institution that you've worked with before and you're kind of familiar with. And I very well take your point, Dr. Naved. You've scolded me about this before. But yeah, so I think the only thing I can say is the delays are bureaucratic and nothing else. Thank you, everyone. We are kind of over time, but tea is served outside. Please do feel free to bring a cup back into this auditorium. The next session in this auditorium is on trade, and we'll start in 10 minutes. Thank you.